Okay, so Josh and I are back to look at another video, this time Rebel Wisdom's conversation between David Fuller and Zubin. Oh,
Damania.
thank you. They were discussing Joe Rogan and his recent two interviews with Peter McCullogh and Robert Malone in particular. So Josh and I are going to get into that. Before we do, though, we thought it would be sensible if each of us took a couple of minutes to give you, the audience, a sense of where we are coming from in terms of what we think of Joe Rogan in general and what we thought of those two interviews on Joe Rogan in particular, before getting into the discussion that Rebel Wisdom had about Joe Rogan and these two videos and a few other things. So Josh, do you want to start off and I'll pick up from where you leave off?
Sounds good. As far as my impressions of Rogan, I've been aware of him for a very long time. Didn't really pay that much attention to his podcast in the early days. I think I was sort of tangentially aware of it, but I thought he was maybe a little bit of he did have a little bit of that meathead persona, like through news radio being like the sort of jock guy in that character, and then on Fear Factor. But as I've
I forgot he was in news radio. I forgot about that. I used to like that show.
Yeah.
I forgot he was in that. Yeah, sorry, carry on. I completely forgot about that.
Yep. Yeah, and seeing some of his comedy specials over the years too. But yeah, just kind of he's matured and just explored his different interests in this podcast format, which has gotten a lot of interest from a lot of people from various different backgrounds. And it seems like in general the attractor there is his, and they talk about this in the Zubin Rebel Wisdom thing that we're going to talk about, just his authenticity. Like, he really comes across as authentic. He has these long form conversations, and he's open to changing his mind, open to being corrected with new information. And he goes down different rabbit holes that are interesting to him. And so some people find, some of those objectionable or not interesting, but he's always kind of following his interest. And it seems like, now with all the notoriety and kind of the pushback around, misinformation or platforming voices that don't fit sort of the mainstream narrative or whatever, he's doing a little bit of like soul searching and thinking about what kind of responsibility he might have as far as bringing some balance to those kind of things. So all throughout it, my general perception is positive. I like him as a person generally from what I've seen, and I just think he's authentic, and we'll kind of see what happens going forward. But I think obviously I think he'll continue to do that, whether he ends up getting deplatformed from Spotify or not. I think he'll do very well because he just resonates with so many people.
Yeah, whether he gets deplatformed from Spotify or not, he's not going to lose his 100 million audience or whatever it is. Yeah, I mean, I broadly agree with everything that you said. I mean, I'll just add a couple of things to it. I wouldn't want to challenge any of that, so I'll just add a couple of things to it. I don't particularly like him as a comedian. I don't think his stand-up is particularly good, personally. But that's just personal taste. But as a podcaster, as an interviewer, as an inquirer into stuff, I think he's absolutely fantastic. I really do. I think he's got an ideal combination of personal qualities. He has a physical imposing presence, but he's in no way a bully, right? But equally, you can't bully him. You can't bully him, right? He's pugnacious and compassionate, right? He has these really nice, almost contradictory, but he makes them complementary qualities, right? And I think he brings a huge amount to. Never before Joe Rogan have people sat down and just listened to conversations for 3 hours. And exactly as you said, he follows his interest. And because of that, it's genuine, it's authentic. He is open and curious and wants to know more. And the audience goes along with him. And yeah, I really can't think of anything to criticize about him as a podcaster. I really can't. I mean, the one final thing I will say is that, and he would be the first to admit that he doesn't get everything right, but he's not lying to you, right? He's not setting out to deceive you ever, I don't think, right? He's always openly, genuinely inquiring. And yeah, he may go down some erroneous pathways, but he's not doing so in order to take you to falsehood, right? It's, in fact, the journey to falsehood and discovering that and coming back again is in fact progress towards truth, right? So yeah. So I'm basically a big fan and have nothing bad to say about him.
Yeah.
What about the interviews? What about your impression of the interviews that he did with Malone and McCullogh? McCullogh, I believe he likes it.
Right. Yeah. So those are the two main sort of, antithesis, COVID antithesis positions that have been pushed back against and criticized. So Rebel Wisdom's done some analysis on them, others as well. And I haven't actually watched both of them in their entirety. So my impressions are based on pieces that have been pulled out and looked at and conversations around them. And I know you have watched both of them, so there may be some pieces that I'm missing. But in general, it seems like, both of them are well-credentialed, experienced, had years of respectable work in their fields, and they came onto the podcast with their perceptions and spoke to those. And speaking of not intentionally lying, I don't think either of them are doing that either. But I do think that there's a sense of like emotional capture that happened because of some experiences that they have where they kind of doubled down on some of these antithesis things and almost became like dogmatic or religious about it. And that's why they end up being inflexible, like they can't be moved off of certain positions. It seems like even when Rogan with McCullogh pushed back against the idea that you can't get COVID twice, McCullogh was like, oh no, what's happening there is something, so he couldn't be moved from that position.
I'm really sorry to interrupt, but it's a relevant interruption. It really is. McCullogh actually retracted that in Malone's interview. Malone said, oh, by the way, I spoke to Peter before coming on, and he said that thing he said about you can't get COVID twice, that was pre-Omicron, right? And so he has already somewhat stepped back from that position. So A, he stepped back from that position, and B, has thus shown himself capable of stepping back from a position that he's currently held, right? So he has softened a little bit on that, saying Omicron has changed that. So
yeah, it seems like on the thesis and maybe on antithesis side with Omicron and some of the recent trends, it's like, and they get into this in the piece, those extreme narratives are basically collapsing, and thesis is looking for an exit strategy, and antithesis is at least on some points conceding some things that they didn't. So yeah, hopefully, these are good signs as far as synthesis. Absolutely. Right?
Absolutely.
So I think that's pretty much it. They presented well. They had their positions. Some of them were kind of these harder or not correct actually when you drill into the details, but they're sort of like emotionally captured by some of it. So yeah, that in a nutshell, I think that's it for me.
Yeah, I as you say, I've watched them both all the way through recently, which I hadn't done before. I'd seen bits of them and people talking about them, but I hadn't actually watched the whole things through. So I've done that just in the last few days, so it's fairly fresh in my mind. And like I was saying to you before we came on to before we started recording, what really struck me and surprised me was how unemotional and how measured and how cautious and how hesitant they were to jump to unjustified conclusions they were throughout the interview. Malone in particular, on several occasions, 4 or 5 occasions, something like that, Joe Rogan said, so does that mean that blah, blah, blah? And he said, no, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that there's some very disturbing signal here and it doesn't make sense and we should be looking much more closely at it and no one is looking at it. That's what I'm saying. And, that sounds completely reasonable to me, right? Like an expert is coming on saying, this is worrying me, we should be looking more at it and we're not looking more at it. And why are we not looking more at it? This is strikes me as completely reasonable. The other thing I would say is that both of them were very, very specific when they made allegations, accusations, statements of, you know, that might come across as surprising or shocking. They always said, and this is based on this thing, this document, this email, this study, this whatever, right? And so now I don't know. I'm not trying to say that everything they said was absolutely factually accurate. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is they said it in such a way that it is easily checkable, right? They cited the reasons for saying so, and so that can then go and be easily checked by other people, as opposed to vague statements which are not checkable. So I thought that in both cases, McCullogh on a couple of occasions, like with this has been picked up all over the place, right? That you can't get COVID twice. It's impossible, right? And that statement that it's impossible, that unequivocal, it's impossible, has what's been picked up on, right? Now, and this is going to be one of my main criticisms of the Rebel Wisdom film, is this kind of obfuscation, right? Now, even if that's not true, even if it's just really unlikely that you get COVID a second time having had it once, right? Even if it's only vanishingly unlikely and not impossible, what difference does that actually make to the main body of the points that he was making, right? And in fact, he has already, but I would imagine that if challenged, what you're saying, it is absolutely impossible, not even one ever is possible, right? That he would probably, well, okay, maybe the odd one here and there, which I think, in fact, sorry, I'm waffling on a bit here, but later on in the interview, he did say, do you know what? It is possible. It might happen occasionally, but we can basically write it off as a nothing thing. So, yeah, anyway, just to reiterate, I found them both to be way more measured, unwilling to hyperbolize and jump to premature conclusions than they have been portrayed. But as I said to you before, also, this is through my eyes, my lens, with my opinions and my biases, and you know that's what I thought. Whether other people would see it the same way, I couldn't vouch for. But I'll stop there. I've got much more to say, but it'll come up later on anyway, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, just before we move on, just a couple maybe relevant thoughts with Malone. So I would agree. My perception of their, again, like how they presented in the interviews is very, you know, they have this scientific medical background, you know, research academics. Of course, they tend not to speak in absolutes. So it's that's why it's maybe a little more noticeable when McCullogh does, even if he retracts it a little bit or whatever. It's like usually, you know, the science-minded people are kind of like, well, you know, based on the evidence, that it seems like this. Not just unequivocally, this is how things are. And then with Malone, at least, one of the comments that Damania makes, I forget whether it's this one or a previous interview, but he kind of toned it down for Rogan, is because there are other clips of him saying things like, you know, if you make this irrevocable decision, it was this interview, if you make the irrevocable decision to get this vaccine, you should know that, you know, and he's listing all these harms that aren't really supported. So just a couple of relevant thoughts around that.
No, you make a very good point. I've seen that video. I don't know if it's the same one, but I've seen a video of him warning parents about their children taking the vaccines, and there were things he said in there that made me wince. And I'm very, very much against children certainly being forced to take them. You know, I'm strongly against that. But some of the things he said even made me wince. Like, wow, that's a bit of a strong claim. You know what I mean? So yes, what you say is absolutely valid. He did tone it down from other things that I have seen of him. We'll get into this later on, though, what the motivations for this might be, because they talk about it in the film. We'll get into this later on.
So for the most, there aren't many things that I disagree with. Actually,
okay. This should be fun then, because there's lots and lots of things.
It'll be you being like, why you disagree, and then maybe, in some cases I'll probably agree with some of what you're saying, but it'll just be interesting to hear your kind of any resistance you had, and then kind of see where we land.
Okay, so let me share screen and play a short clip, and then we'll come back and talk about it.
That in him, the conditioned medical side sees that in him too, but then also sees where he goes wrong in terms of his thinking, being a little more than a little more sort of inclined towards the conspiratorial and the fact that, listen, because these things are true, these things are wrong with, say, healthcare or our system, these other things also must be true. And I think that's not necessarily the case. So
he's making a sort of he's leveling a sort of criticism, an accusation, but he's not actually giving a clear example of what he means. And so it's and this is a recurring thing that I want to pick up on.
The language he was using there was kind of general. He didn't provide specifics, but it landed for me as far as and I think there's another bit later where they talk about this explicitly. The fact that so Rogan's authentic curiosity, and actually similar to Z-Dog, doesn't tend to lead him to be interested in interviewing people who are already representing like well represented positions, like establishment, mainstream. So his curiosity would have him, invite these kind of heterodox, different people with different opinions and credentials, right? And but the fact that there may be some disagreement around this, but as it relates to him kind of going in that direction of, if these things are not true about the thesis position, then it's sort of leaping to these other conclusions. And it's almost like he got caught up in this little bit of an echo chamber with this group of heterodox doctors. But having caught that was the case, now he's like course correcting. Anyway, that's the impression that it seems like Zubin and Rebel Wisdom have.
Yeah, that's certainly the impression they conveyed, and I'd like to challenge it in a couple of different ways. So, firstly, this notion that it's very few people, right? I mean, I believe they named Robert Malone, Peter McCullogh, Pierre Corey, and one other. I can't think who it was now.
Anyway, right?
Sorry,
Kirsch, I think.
Yeah, Steve Kirsch. That's right. That was the gang of four. That's right. And they gave the impression it's just these four people self-referencing each other and doing the rounds of podcasts. And this is just simply not true, right? There are loads and loads and loads of people in the medical profession out there pushing back against all kinds of aspects of the thesis narrative. The Great Barrington Declaration, I looked it up earlier today. The Great Barrington Declaration has been signed by, was it 62,500 medical professionals and scientists, right? 900 and something thousand people in total, of which 62,500. So, to pretend that this is some tiny niche crowd of fringe doctors is profoundly misleading. And David, quite honestly, should be ashamed of himself creating this kind of, and he does this. This is my main gripe with the film as a whole. He does this again and again and again. It's kind of like a hit piece with no real substance. He insinuates bad faith, wrongdoing, misleading, etc., but doesn't ever actually give a concrete example throughout the whole film. Maybe in the last 15 minutes, which I haven't seen the missing bit, but throughout the whole film does not give one single concrete example. And I've got a few examples of this written down, which I want to come back to. And honestly, David, I'll say this directly to you, directly to the camera. David, you should be ashamed of yourself. You know better than this. You've become a hopeless victim of your own preconceptions and biases in this matter, in my opinion, if you ever see this.
So I think to pick up on one thing you said, there are certainly firstly the group that I think there's a distinction between sort of like the Malones, McCulloghs, the ones who are really strongly advocating for and going overboard. I think that's the bit that's different.
But who gets to say what's going overboard? This is when did they become the arbiter of what is and is not going overboard?
Well, when you can dig into details of claims that are being made and show that they're false. Then
do that. They didn't do that with a single claim. Not one single thing did they actually unpick and say this is wrong because.
Well, to my mind, it's like it's already been addressed through. There were extensive pieces released by Rebel Wisdom during that whole period, right? the saga with the Weinsteins, Brett mostly. And right, because there were interviews there too with the same crowd. And so, investigating those claims, they were detailed in a very long article. So I feel like that's been addressed. And that's why he said at the beginning, Fuller said he didn't want to get bogged down into the details there because there are more interesting things to talk about now since those have already been addressed. So that's my impression.
So this is a really important point. They're talking about stuff that they did before these particular interviews on Rogan, right? They're not talking about what Malone and McCullogh said in these particular interviews, are they? They're the debunking that they did of all this was before those interviews took place. This was around the ivermectin time. Yeah, this was Pierre Corey and ivermectin. As you rightly pointed out, these interviews have, at least by Malone, it's a toning down of things that he said elsewhere in public. I completely accept that point, but nevertheless, they did not address any single thing that was said in these interviews, right? And say this was wrong because of this.
Was the ovaries thing that was incorrect not mentioned during the Rogan interview?
Well, now the ovaries, the discussion about ovaries was not to do with spike protein. It was to do with nanoparticles. It was to do with the lipid nanoparticles that encase the mRNA, right, and transfer it into the cell. So yes, the talk about gathering in the ovaries, this was McCullogh, I'm pretty sure it was McCullogh talking about this. He was talking about the lipid nanoparticles are in ovaries and not testes, right? This was one of the contrasts he drew, is that it emerges in ovaries and not testes. And he also talked about problems that have been emerging around menstruation. Again, I think this was McCullogh. It might have been, no, this was Malone, wasn't he? Because he was talking about the rabbi. The rabbis who have a very keen awareness of the menstrual cycles of the women in their congregation, right? And because making more Orthodox Jews is very important in Orthodox Jewish communities, right? And so the rabbis are very reports of, so and again he was quick to say, hey, this is anecdotal stuff, it's not conclusive, but it is disturbing signal which demands further investigation. And once again, this Malone, that was his main thing all the way through. This is disturbing signal. It requires further investigation, and it's not being investigated. If he was making one point overarching throughout the interview, that was the point that he was making. And McCullogh, if he was making one single point throughout the interview, it was that early treatment had been neglected, suppressed, not taken up. And he's talking about early treatment to stop people ever getting to hospital, right? He's not talking about what people are doing in hospitals. He's talking about what medical professionals are doing to treat people in their homes such that they never develop symptoms serious enough to need to go to the hospital. That's what he was talking about primarily in his interview. Both of which I think any sensible person would agree. Yeah, these are, these are important things.
Yeah. I think one of the main, so there was a bit of this like referencing back to claims that were made previously and may or may not have been made in the Rogan interviews. One thing that they definitely, at least from ZDog's perspective as a hospitalist, felt like was like an ad hominem, and an indication of this kind of inclination toward a grand conspiracy theory that all the hospitalists are in on it, that they're incentivized to not or to get you to take the vaccine and to follow these things that aren't good for you, and that there was definitely strong pushback against that, and pointing to the fact that it goes from these defensible and laudable, pushbacks against the dominant narrative, which is also leaving a lot out and pushing too hard in certain directions and should be challenged, right? So they're bringing that in, but then it's like where it goes overboard or starts to have problems is when it becomes this grand conspiracy theory that can't be disproven. So that seemed to be one of the main ones I actually got into in this discussion. And just back to the overall sense making nature of this. for me at least, is like, we could go back and, review all the various details of the different studies and the claims and the rebuttals that happened through that period. But at a high level, like, it seems to me like what they're trying to point to in this is the need for good faith dialogue between different positions. And where that's lacking on the thesis side, antithesis side, is, and you probably disagree with this to some extent, but the fact that this small group of antithesis experts is not really engaging in any good faith debates or dialogues, right? They're saying that they want to or will, but then they make the conditions such that it really wouldn't be. So that's on the antithesis side, and then on the thesis side.
Do you mind, Terry, if I jump in? It's just I've already got a few things I would like to respond to what you've just said, because so firstly, this idea that these antithesis group won't engage with the thesis. Has Rebel Wisdom invited Robert Malone or Andrew McCullogh on to have a difficult interview? How much pushback does Zubin Damania get when he goes on Rebel Wisdom, right? How much pushback does David get from Zubin? I mean, these guys have obviously become good friends, and good luck to them. But how much pushback do they get from each other when they interview each other, when they have conversations with each other, right? They congratulate each other quite a lot. Yeah, that's really good. I like that framing, this kind of thing. I don't see a great deal of pushback going on there, right? And so, and this is generally true on Rebel Wisdom. There's people come on, they present their ideas, they present their theories, and David encourages them to do so, and most of the time he does so very well. But he's not pushing back at them, right? He's not generally challenging them on it. He's asking them to expound on their ideas. And you were talking about also that he was upset that he said that the frontline doctors were in on it in some way, right? There's a leap from there are systemic and difficulties with incentives. There's a leap from that to, and all the doctors are in on it. And again, this is maybe my own bias coming through here, but I did not hear that at all in what they said in these interviews. What I heard was that doctors are unable to do their jobs because of the constraints placed upon them by drugs being withheld and therapies being withheld, and known protocols not being distributed or indeed being blocked. So he's not actually blaming the individual doctors. He is blaming the system from stopping them from being able to do their job properly as doctors. But again, I stress, McCullogh was not primarily talking about hospitals. He was talking about the lack of treatment that exists to stop people getting into hospitals, right? And Malone, sorry, go on. No, go on, please.
I'm not actually sure which, and maybe we can look at that section again, whether it was Malone or McCullogh, but that was the thing that Zubin really wanted to push back against was, there was also a comment around like only 500 doctors
know how
to treat COVID.
But again, I took that as the CDC or the NIAID or whatever have failed to distribute have failed to notify the majority of doctors of the protocols that are known to work, and it is only 500, say, rebel doctors that are actually doing this thing because the system has not. I mean, what? Let me ask you personally. What is your sense of what you should do if you think you have COVID? What should you do in terms of self-care to not have to go to the hospital? What other than stay away from other people, right, and not infect them? What are you supposed to do to look after yourself? What is your perception of the public health advice as to what you should do to look after yourself if you think you have COVID or you've tested positive for COVID?
Yeah, there were actually I had a couple things that, one of them actually might have been Omicron because I didn't test it. It was very mild. But earlier I had a flu that lasted for a few days. It was one of the worst I'd had in years. And I did suspect it, but I got a PCR test and it was negative. Not that those are terribly conclusive, but yeah, for me at least, I'm healthy. I take supplements. my siblings and close people, we've all been sharing information about, vitamin D. That's actually pretty surprising. There's an interview on Dark Horse about just how effective it is. And I've actually upped my vitamin D dose to close to 5,000 units a day based on that. So basically,
but my point is that didn't come from public health authorities, right? That's come from your own tuning into what's going on around you. That hasn't come from public health advice.
Oh yeah. I mean, that's been pointed out by various people. There's no incentive. There's really no incentive in this sort of government industrial complex where pharmaceutical companies are enmeshed with people in government positions, and they come onto in the media. They're not subsidizing advertising on being the main sponsors for some of the CNN broadcasts, and they come on and basically give their opinions. So of course the incentives are drive toward a vaccine or something produced by pharmaceutical companies, not just things you can get at the pharmacy or easily on your own.
But no, the point I'm making is what Peter McCullogh was saying was that the public health service authorities have been criminally negligent in not promoting as hard as they can early treatments, right, to be taken at first symptom or at first positive test, or even with something like vitamin D, somewhat as a prophylactic, right? It reduces your chance of getting infected in the first place and reduces your chance of getting seriously ill if you do get infected, right? And the point he's making is the fact that these things, and it doesn't mean that you don't also want vaccines, right? It's not like vitamin D is anti-vax. Vitamin D is a simple thing that everyone can do to reduce their chances of having to go to the hospital. And this is his point. I mean, he didn't actually talk about vitamin D. And also, sorry, while I'm talking about this, the early treatment, ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, again, as McCullogh and Malone were talking about them, are not miracle drugs, right? Take ivermectin and you're not going to get COVID. Take ivermectin, you won't get sick. That's not at all the way they were talking about it. They were talking about these drugs as being vital components of a multi-drug treatment protocol, right? Which can be administered at different ways at different stages of the infection, kind of thing. Like all of these things are simply important tools in the kit. Each one does a particular thing to fight the advance of the infection or the suppression of the worst of the symptoms, right? And so that's what I mean. They were incredibly measured. They did not make any outrageous claims. And that's not to say that they haven't done in other places in the past. And maybe they've learned their lesson from the pushback they've received, right, in places like Rebel Wisdom for some of the more outrageous things they've said in public in the past, and have learned their lesson and have toned it down. And maybe they are now being, this is another point I want to pick up on, I'll give you an opportunity, maybe they are now being more responsible heterodox actors. This was a theme that came up a couple of times, right? What does responsible heterodoxy look like? And I have a question to put to you. What does responsible orthodoxy look like? And why is that question not asked in balance to what does responsible heterodoxy look like?
Yeah, there's a lot in there.
Yeah, there was. Sorry, I jumped to pile on you.
No, just try to remember, pull the different threads. But so I think in my perception, again, not having watched the entirety of the Rogan interviews, but my perception is that the where they go overboard is so again they're bringing points that are valid, that there are these other approaches, whether it's vitamin D or things like ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine, that should be considered, looked at, investigated, considered as a potential part of a regimen. The issue seems to be where and there's some other doctors too, where there was a female doctor that Rebel was interviewed, and she was just like, they actually asked her the question directly, is there anything that could convince you that ivermectin is not effective as a treatment for COVID? And she said, no. And so there's a bit of this kind of like, yeah, over yeah, just almost like religious, like it's this, you know, extremely powerful thing that's being suppressed. And even for characters who aren't saying that it's, you know, it's like a miracle cure, there is a tendency toward that conspiracy thinking where it's like this thing's being suppressed and that can be shown, you know, not to be the case. It's more so that there's a lack of, like, from the thesis side, there's this over focus on a certain set of what's the word, remedies, right? Again, it's, you know, vaccines, mandates, lockdowns, you know, all these sort of like control things, and then vaccines for the pharmaceutical benefit. So I feel like there's an important distinction there where it's like, yes, some of the overboard antithesis characters are bringing valid points, which are important to include in the, you know, the good faith dialogues around, you know, what are good remedies and how to proceed with as you were saying, you know, a mix of approaches, not just vaccines, but these other things too. It's just so the irresponsible heterodoxy is over privileging or over you know, presenting things like ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine as more effective than they've actually been proven to be, or prematurely, like, or pointing to studies that are actually highly flawed, like the Uttar Pradesh study in India, which is one that's pointed to for ivermectin, I think. So anyway, I think that's an important point of distinction, because reasonable people, I think, would agree that, you know, we should look at all potential remedies and do studies. And yes, that didn't happen. And that's irresponsible orthodoxy. So I think responsible from both ends is,
this is exactly
having a position
the
but being open to
responsible orthodoxy should encourage challenges to itself, right? In order to remain the orthodoxy, you have to be able to withstand challenge. Otherwise, something else should be the orthodoxy, right? You know, at what point does heterodoxy become orthodoxy? I mean, I think this is a discussion for another time, but is orthodoxy defined simply as the majority view? Is that by definition the orthodoxy? Or is it the
the term itself is almost implies that ossification, you know, it's too rigid, right? Orthodox. But you know, you could soften it and say it's more traditional, or you know, has history, so it's conservative. Like there's
sort of
there's always this
view, right? Whether that's the older view, the more traditional view, or simply the majority view, I don't know. As I say, it's an interesting discussion for another time. But it does feel to me like a healthy orthodoxy should encourage challenge, should welcome challenge.
It should be built in, you know. Like evolution of
heterodoxy should be seen as a necessary reaffirmation of the orthodoxy, right? And if the orthodoxy is unable to withstand the challenges, then that is do you know what I mean? That needs to be. But so a couple of things on what you were just the make valid points and then go too far, right? Two things on this. Firstly, why spend so much time and energy focusing on where by whoever definition they've gone off the rails, and why not spend some time amplifying the valid points that are being made, right? So this is one question. And because this would be responsible heterodoxy, right? Is discerning what is reasonable and what is unreasonable heterodoxy, and amplifying the reasonable heterodoxy so that the orthodoxy is more pressured to listen to it, right? Because it's coming from a more legitimate place, right? So filtering the heterodoxy and shouting more loudly about that which is reasonable and needs to be heard and isn't being heard, this to me is part of responsible heterodoxy. That other question you asked, I can't remember what her name was, but I know who you mean. The woman who said she could never possibly be convinced that ivermectin doesn't work. Right. Again, let me pose a question to you as a human being. If you had seen overwhelming evidence, what you perceive to be overwhelming evidence for something, right? And then you were asked the question, is there anything that you could be shown to show that this wasn't true? What would your response be? Now, okay, no is a bit unequivocal, but if you said something like, Oh, I don't know. It'd be really, really, really hard. I'm pretty strongly convinced that would be reasonable, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it specifics matter, of course, and in this case, yeah. I mean, at some point, it's like if you start getting into like what's reality, you can go down a whole thing, but it's looking at the scientific evidence and literature and et cetera. At the time that the interview was given, I would venture to say that well over 80% of let's say qualified or scientifically literate people who looked at the evidence would not be inclined to say to decide on that side. And so when people get that, and again, it's not hard to see patterns, and I'm not sure what that doctor's story was. I know she hadn't been in the public eye. I think she made some heterodox statements, got attacked. It seems to be a common theme. It's like they're actually making good, valid points to start with. It's like pushing back against the orthodoxy that's missing points, have blind spots or incentives that are nefarious, at least not really good for the whole population. So they start off there, and then it's like with the pushback, there's almost like an emotional retrenching and digging in of heels and getting overly locked into certain positions and over privileging or presenting certain remedies or facts as either effective or claiming that the vaccine has these things that are going to make your infant's head explode in the womb.
Yeah.
Right. So
do you not feel sometimes that those more extreme and more easily dismissed rantings are then used as an excuse to dismiss all reasonable concerns as well? This is what feels this is what feels like what's happening to me, right? Even with Rebel Wisdom, which is why I'm so upset with this film.
My perception is that, I feel like they've done a pretty good job of threading the needle between, and also to get back to your why focus on sort of problematic or overboard voices on the heterodox side when there's so many issues on the orthodox side. And I would say it's
well, and also when there are so many valid points that could be amplified on the heterodox side was also the point.
Yeah. I think, well, it seems to me like people like Zubin, Rebel Wisdom, not so much like the Vinay Prasads. They're not trying to, at least I haven't seen him commenting on like heterodox voices that go overboard. Maybe he has, but it's really trying to thread the needle of like, there's some signal in those voices, but there's some noise too, and it's trying to like point out the noise to sort of, it's like hygiene for the heterodox or non-orthodox or thesis end of things. It's like, yeah, we're aiming for truth, and there's some things that are not being presented from the orthodox or thesis, and there are some things that are valid signal from the heterodox, but let's try to sift the wheat from the chaff. And I feel like that's kind of where they're coming from.
Yeah, but I think all they're doing is throwing away the chaff, and they're not preserving the wheat. Yeah, I like that analogy because that makes it very clear. Yeah, all we're doing is throwing away all it feels like they're doing is throwing away the chaff. Because there are two ways of going about.
You don't feel like they acknowledge the validity of some of the points and the fact that it's.
I think they acknowledge the fact that there are valid points, but they don't amplify those valid points, right? I think that there's two ways of going about distilling, refining the signal from a sense-making point of view, right? One is to highlight and reject the errors. Another is to focus on and amplify, or the noise, say, right? One is to point out and reject the noise. The other is to focus in on and amplify the signal. Both of these are valid approaches, probably should be used in tandem with each other, really, right? Probably both should be used equally. And it doesn't feel like both are being used equally. Again, my bias is my lens. I completely accept responsibility for that. But I would say for me, 90 to 95% of what Malone and McCullogh were saying in those interviews, and I'm restricting it to those interviews, accepting the point that they've said other things outside of those. But 90 to 95% of it felt like signal. Very little of it felt like noise.
And that may very well be the case.
And even if not true signal, verifiable and checkable, easily verifiable and checkable signal, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's still arguably valid and useful to point out the 5%, if there is a 5% that's problematic or is noise, right? And what was the other point I had? Oh, just that. So someone from a more thesis, maybe not all the way thesis, but more on that side, I think could easily watch these interviews and feel, as you do, about them not amplifying the heterodox stuff. They would feel like they would see this as almost as much misinformation as as anything, because it's like they're saying all these good things and pointing out how these
saying all these nice things about
Joe
Rogan.
They're criticizing them a little bit, but not nearly enough. Yeah.
What I actually wanted to return to was the question I asked you personally was, if based on the messaging you've received from newspapers, television, representatives of the public health institutions, what should you do to minimize the impact of COVID on you if you get COVID? What from the messaging you've received, what should you, we've already talked about vitamin D, but is there any advice that you are aware of that has come over the public health wavelengths that you can do to mitigate the effects of COVID on yourself and not end up in hospital?
If we were just talking about public health messaging, I wouldn't have said the vitamin D thing. I appreciate that. No, we made that point. Yeah, that's been lacking. I mean, but is there anything? Is there anything
at all? I mean, forget. Is there anything you can think of that has come over the public health airwaves that is something you can do to make a difference as to your likely outcomes from COVID?
Nothing. And of course, I haven't seen every public message, but
fair enough. Certainly
from the federal, the predominant things. It's pretty much all just been the heavy-handed stuff. Stay away from people, social distancing.
If you get really sick, go to the hospital, right?
Right. Wait for the vaccine, and pretty much, yeah. And
I mean, have you been encouraged to go and see your general practitioner if you have early symptoms or an early positive test? Are you encouraged to go and see your general practitioner for advice on how to best treat yourself?
I don't think so.
Wouldn't want that, right? Because the doctor's offices would be completely jammed up. So the point that there has been no serious attempt made at early treatment to mitigate the impact on the health service of COVID infections, right, is a very, very valid one. And why that has happened, how that came about, why that happened, and how to do better in the future are surely vitally important things to pick up on, right? And so that signal, if nothing else, from that Peter McCullogh interview, that was the main thing he was banging on about, right? And that seems to me to be super important signal. So to use any tools at all to try and dismiss other things that he had to say and to forget about that seems wrong to me.
Yeah, I guess it's the same thing we talked about as far as like how much do you amplify the signal versus point out the noise and try to clarify. It's a process, right? I mean, the fact that these conversations are happening, it's and hopefully we're, I mean, I do see hopeful signs like we talked about earlier. Both the extreme ends of the thesis antithesis are kind of collapsing.
I think what we said before is really important. You've got to do both, right? You've got to point out the noise so that it doesn't mislead people, and you've got to amplify the signal so that people focus in on the most important things. But there's always a choice to be made as to which of these two things is more important. Is it more important that people don't believe this nonsense, Or is it more important that more people understand this important idea, right? Which of these two things, where should we be focusing our energy on? Amplifying the important signal or on suppressing the damaging noise, right? There's a choice to be made there.
Yeah, I just had a thought that maybe will be helpful. So part of the reason that your sensitivity to the tendency to dismiss people that are bringing heterodox views, that's an important one, because there is, from the orthodoxy, it's all the way through. It's like that. Even the efforts to deplatform Rogan now are basically like anything that disagrees with this is we're just going to completely exclude it from the conversation. And so I could see from that perspective, it's like, well, why, if we actually resonate with a lot of the antithesis, because it would, at least with the signal in it, why is it that we're not amplifying that versus focusing on nitpicking on where it's going wrong or overboard? So that I can understand that. At the same time, all through the thing, I feel like, we if we're going to do good sense making, we want to, it's always aiming for truth. So, where even on a side where we kind of resonate with, it's like, it's important to again, separate the wheat from the chaff so that we don't go wrong, go overboard. I'm reminded of Ollie Beinard saying, when he first listened to the McCullogh thing, he actually had kind of an emotional, like, oh shit, maybe if this is true, then, that the downstream implications of that, like for myself and people I care about. So we kind of had to like breathe through that, and then, over time, like get more information, learn where some of those claims were overboard and so forth. So yeah, just the importance of sense making. But yeah, like I said, I understand. And I feel like it's important to keep in mind the efforts to just dismiss when certain facts are gotten wrong, even in the case of like Rogan not challenging them or not bringing on, balancing voices or whatever.
Well, I actually see it's less his responsibility to do that, because he's talking in the moment live, right? And he can't know everything about everything. I actually think a greater responsibility for that kind of thing falls on places like Rebel Wisdom, who have time to think about it and do some research and some work afterwards, and then come back and challenge it. I mean, I feel not sorry, not at all, but it's Joe Rogan is in almost an impossible position, right? He started this thing just as a laugh with some friends, and then it gets popular, and all of a sudden more notorious people or more well-known people want to come on, and this thing explodes, and before you know it, he's got whatever it is, 100 million listeners every month, like incredible. Now, he never signed up to be the biggest broadcaster in the world, right? Like, he never intended that. He never signed up for that. It's just kind of happened. And I think this is a really interesting question. To what degree is he responsible for what happens on his channel, right? Because it is just a guy having conversations with people that he finds interesting. And that's what's good about it, right? Is that it is still just that. And yet these conversations have now become actually consequential, in that they affect the public discourse and public opinion, right? On a large scale. So my question, I guess, is something along the lines of, to what degree is he obligated to accept the responsibility of the position he now finds himself in? I mean, I think he's shouldering that responsibility by virtue of the kind of person that he is. He recognizes what's going on, and he's a big enough man to say, okay, that's where I am. I'm willing to acknowledge that fact and shoulder some of that responsibility. But he's not under any obligation to do that, is he? He's just a guy doing a podcast at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. But it's interesting just thinking about the public square notion. Like, if enough of the population has a certain reaction to something, it's like, you can keep putting out the same content or having the same message, but maybe you're better off listening to it and making adjustments if you think that it makes sense, which is what Rogan's doing. I think obviously a lot of the criticism, and certainly the the N-word thing was cherry picked and not really relevant now, or obviously just an attempt to smear and do anything to get him to shut him up, basically to deplatform him, which is very unlikely to work anyway. But yeah, it's like he started this thing as a certain effort, and then it's like, yeah, to what extent do you want to pay attention to the sort of the noosphere, like what you're getting back from people? And from my perception, a lot of those people are captured in certain ideologies or echo chambers and bubbles that are missing a big part of the picture, and that's why they're so triggered by him, or why they are so anti anything heterodox. But that's an experience that some of us are having, and it's like, yeah, so each of us gonna have to decide how we're gonna co-participate with the whole thing. And yeah, Rogan's being very mature and responsible, I think, in his handling of it.
Yeah, I agree. I really enjoyed his response. It was a kind of non-apology apology. He didn't actually apologize because he hasn't done anything wrong, right? But nevertheless, I appreciate the position I'm in, and I will try and do better. And I think he got it just exactly right. I think he struck it just exactly right.